Hi, welcome to Anthroposophical. This is going to be a talk about the relation between Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and Anthroposophy. So I think a good place to start will be the famous verse. I won't read all of it, but one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. And immediately with this verse about the ring and the image behind me, we have something very evocative, very moody. And I think that's a good place to start, because this sense of a binding, a kind of darkness, and although in many ways it's quite sweet, the whole Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, it has this kind of cute nature. And we might think of pixies and elves and things like this, and we might think, ah, how sweet, how kind of harmless Tolkien is. But it really isn't when you get deeper into the themes of Tolkien. It's very much the theme of evil and the confrontation with darkness. And there are many reasons for this, which we'll go into in the course of the talk today. And this sense, we'll explore this sense of binding, of finding, and of ruling. So we have this sense of power. We have a way of working with these ideas of power and rulership and spiritual seeking, and a sense for binding. Now, none of these words, when we're dealing with Tolkien, none of the words are superfluous. They're not just thrown out there like we do in many areas of life today. They're very well considered. They are, when we come to the actual words of the runes, as we see inscribed on the ring behind me, and the very creation of the names of the characters themselves, when we think of Gandalf, Aragorn, Legolas, Orthanc, Mordor, these words are created out of Tolkien's long study of Norse tradition, Icelandic myths and legends of Great Britain, and his long study back over the years through his time at Oxford, and he's living really with the whole elemental environment of Great Britain, but not only Great Britain, also the profound impact that Europe made on Tolkien. And this is what we'll mention also a bit later, with Tolkien's journey down on the Rhine, through Germany, down to Switzerland, coming then also from Austria, from Innsbruck to Zurich, I believe. And his experiences there of the difference between Europe and Great Britain, and how this filled his soul from these early years. So that's something that we'll explore also a bit later, and the whole background that Tolkien brings with him for his meditation through these different books, the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, and then the Lord of the Rings, and how this whole history of Europe, the First World War, plays into the creation of the drama that unfolds in this book and in his legendarium. I think this is a wonderful word to describe what Tolkien in effect creates out of this far-reaching perspective over myths and legends and back into time and into the very imaginative structure of how reality is put together. And that's kind of my bridge into anthroposophy, because I feel there are many things that have yet to be explored in the relation between Tolkien and anthroposophy. And there are many people who are going to be watching this who already know anthroposophy, know the work of Rudolf Steiner, and know the background of Tolkien to Owen Barfield and C.S. Lewis and their connection to Steiner, or their knowing of Steiner. So I'm not going to go too deep into that. I'm not going to go too deep into the historical references. I'm more going to explore some of the ideas. So the first thing really is this sense of a ring. So what is a ring? We can think of, in the occult tradition, a snake biting its own tail. A circle with the head of the snake biting its own tail as a picture for eternal time, how time eats itself up. And this, I think, is a good place. There are other ways one could interpret that, but this is a good place to start to make that transition into a kind of more eternal perspective of what the circle means in that sense. And we could also call to mind the circle of the sun as it rises in the morning, and like the Egyptians would do, it goes over midday, it sets in the evening and goes over into the night, and while we're asleep, it's forming the circle round in a very ordered way. And whether we think of the earth as the center, as they did in the older times, and the sun going around the earth, or if we think of the sun at the center and us with the earth going around the sun, we're working with these interweaving spirals, interweaving circles. And I think that's a very nice place to start in thinking of what the ring means. Also, very nicely, to behind me over my left shoulder, we have one of these wonderful maps on fabric here of Tolkien. And there we have the compass as a ring. And maps are very important for Tolkien. And I think they're very evocative of the whole journey, that the fellowship also are a circle of people that are bound together by, as we would say in anthroposophy, bound together by karma, interwoven with each other to carry responsibility for a task. And how this orients the whole journey of the fellowship through Middle Earth and Tolkien's wonderful maps. We can see this behind me with the compass form to my left. And we can also think of the whole heritage there of Tolkien coming from the British Isles and this sense for journeys overseas. Now, if we look to, I'm not going to show it here, but if you look to the map of Middle Earth, you can see Mordor, Sauron, and the I'll just put it up here. Sauron and Mount Doom in Mordor. Mordor forms like a so this is the all-seeing eye over Mordor at the gate to Mount Doom in the background. And on those maps, you can see that shape of the half circle, like the chalice here with the two horns, forming the mountains around Mordor. And you get this sense of almost like a forked tongue of the serpent coming down the map and forming that mountain ridge around Mordor. So here we see we're looking into what we might describe in anthroposophy as a view into the inner earth, into what then erupts out of the inner earth with this volcano in the background. And it's a view down into that. And we'll come to this in this sense for the all-seeing eye, again in its circular form in relation to a ring of power. And this sense for what Tolkien had done with these runes, with his work into language, is really something that we would say from the occult tradition, from Rosicrucianism, creating out of nothing. And it's this distinction that I'd like to make, because it runs all the way through Lord of the Rings. And it's the distinction between visionary clairvoyance and what I'd like to call here intuitive clairvoyance. Now, this is a very deep subject that goes also in the direction of understanding the difference between Jesuitism and Rosicrucianism. And this comes in particularly, I found particularly helpful in the first two lectures of From Jesus to Christ by Rudolf Steiner. And there he goes much deeper into this question. But I'd just like to bring one thing here, which really plays all the way through Lord of the Rings and is part of this talk, which is this difference between visionary clairvoyance and intuitive clairvoyance. And in Jesuitism, the work with suggestion or hypnosis, over against in Rosicrucianism, where we try to present as far as possible to be very conscious of the images we use and the language we use to explain in detail a science of the spirit, as opposed to using images and art to somehow put people to sleep. Now, it's my belief that Tolkien is very consciously creating a work of art out of spiritual realities. And what would be the difference between using art to, in a way, hypnotize people? I think we can compare the two. We can compare the richness and depth and complexity of Lord of the Rings, and we can compare it with perhaps other Hollywood films that interlace the work with occult symbols, but are thereby not allowing the audience free access to those occult symbols, because they are placed in the film and people do not have a way of understanding them consciously. with their conscious mind. And one could say, well, is there an occult teaching to understand occult symbols, whether they come in any art form? And the answer I would give is with anthroposophy. That anthroposophy is really the only spiritual, scientific, and okay, that causes problems for people when they say, well, it's not a science like mathematics or computer science or yeah. But to the extent that we work with the concepts of anthroposophy, we come to develop what we call an intuitive spiritual sight that is able to see how ideas fit together very exactly. And that's why it comes close to this word of science. And in fact, it very much can be a science. But to the extent that we work with the concepts to develop that exact sight of the things that we are studying with anthroposophy. If we don't do that, if we neglect that exact study and inner work and meditation, the danger is that we would fall into the other aspect of the occult, which is visionary. Now, what this means, we can see this all the way through the 20th century, is the visions that would come through what we call the opposing powers in anthroposophy, through Lucifer and Ahriman, would inspire the human being with all kinds of visions. Now, these could be visions of glory, they could be visions of power, they could be visions of control, and we don't have to think too far with the 20th century to find examples of this. We can think of Germany. We can think of the Russian Revolution, the time after, Stalin, Hitler, the different ways in which the masses were mobilized to go into these far-reaching, destructive conflicts that came through the First World War and the Second World War. But before we get carried away and think that that's an easy fight between good and evil, and we can then name our evils as the evil dictatorships of Germany and Russia, we have to remember that the whole thing is not only that, it continues. And also the use of the occult is not limited to these dictatorships. It's also how the Allied powers mobilize their own people to fight in these global battles. So whether the occult is used and we demonize it as the mobilization of the great armies of Germany or Russia, or whether we see that in the mobilization of Britain and America and the Allied powers in their fight against the Axis powers, the same thing is going on. And that's part of what Tolkien is working through in his book, Lord of the Rings. And it's also what Steiner was encouraging us to understand in a far deeper way than is normally the case, of how images, propaganda, the media is used to mobilize people, to influence politics, to work with power in the world. And this is one of the areas where we can bring a number of insights from anthroposophy to look at this whole subject in a deeper way. So this is, I'm just going to add a different image here. This is, many thanks to the Society of New Zealand, the Anthroposophical Society in New Zealand, where I got this image. And this is an example of, very nice example of how things are done, how things are drawn on blackboards in Waldorf education, in anthroposophy. And again, I think it gives a very nice picture of the ring. So we see behind me the human figure, and then we have this interweaving figures of 8 to my right, and above the force 4 rings, and below we have also 4 rings. Now I'm not going to go into describing that. You can just look at this as I'm speaking. The law of imitation. And I think this is very interesting, how just as we were doing at the beginning, looking for this to inwardly follow a circle of the sun around the earth, around us daily through waking and sleeping, and also seeing this breathing between the inner world and the outer world. And it's this sense that we work with in anthroposophy to bring many of these understandings of life and nature and the course of the seasons to our consciousness, so that we can deeper perceive this sense for wholeness, this sense for how all of life is connected. Now, how does this relate then back to these historical questions? Well, we've got here what Steiner calls the end of the Kali Yuga in 1899. So at the end of the 19th century, we have the end of an era of darkness that extends over thousands of years. And this was an insight that came through the original roots of anthroposophy in theosophy. So it came over then from the East, from India, and was very much in those early days determined and influenced and shaped very much by British nationalism, the empire. When we think of Blavatsky and Olcott, it had this very colonial, imperial feeling to it. And then Steiner took it and he split off, and about 1,000 people went with him. And he wanted to give a Christ-centered for a further movement of the whole stream of theosophy into something that could really be fructified by the West. So this wisdom had come over from the East, and he wanted it to be fructified by the West and bring our whole Christology, our sense for Christ and the development of the arts and humanities and the sciences from the West, to fructify this wisdom from the East. And at the same time, he spoke of 1879 as the beginning of the age of Michael, of the Archangel Michael. And he speaks of a casting down of the spirits of darkness into the earth. And it's this that I find, these two aspects of the end of an age of darkness and the beginning of an age of light, and this throwing down of the spirits of darkness from heaven into the earth, which is something that we can find in the Apocalypse, in Revelation, And it's a deeper meditation to work with these ideas, but they find they're very easy and accessible to follow if we think of the whole darkness and battle of good against evil so well depicted in Lord of the Rings. So that's the kind of background that we already see. There's some wonderful connections here between what Steiner depicts in his various lectures about the start of the Age of Michael and the end of the Kali Yuga, and Tolkien's depiction of this battle between the forces of good against the forces of evil, with Sauron, Saruman, and orcs, and fighting against elves, dwarves, men, Gandalf, leading them in this battle centered around the need to destroy the ring. Now, what could this destruction of the ring be? Now, again, if we refer back to what I was saying at the beginning, we got two kinds of challenge here. We've got one challenge, which is a kind of occult, and I'll just share this here. A kind of occult that we've carried over. I'm not going to say in relation to this, because I'm very thankful for this image from this person's book. But we see this all around us in our mystery bookshops all around, have images drawn from various occult books from over the last hundreds of years, and then made up into quite wonderful, I think, new kinds of art where things are depicted and where we have kind of traditions. We have traditions from Wicca. We have traditions from the New Age. We have some of these images from Freemasonry, from the church, and from the new, all the different kinds of new teachings about the spirit that have come forth. And so I've always been drawn to also study these as much as I have anthroposophy, because I find them fascinating. And this is also what Steiner did in his life, was to always study the other streams of research into the spirit, and to be aware of what people are looking at in the world in relation to spiritual teachings. And I find this one particularly interesting because you have these images of the different phases of the moon as it goes from full moon round to new moon. And again, I like this because of the depiction of the moth, and in the center you also have the skull. And I know some people will say, well, oh, this looks very dark and very dark magic-y type thing. Yeah, okay, sure. But these are also realities of the natural world around us. To look at the natural world, to look at the phases of the moon, and to learn to appreciate these things imaginatively. So, okay, we don't then refuse to things that we might say have come out of visionary clairvoyance. We're not going to use this term as something to bash people over the head with and say, oh, that's wrong, you shouldn't do that, that's kind of visionary. But it depends on how people are analyzing these things, how people are thinking about these things, how people are bringing these images into their lives, and whether they are able to form what I would call intuitive clairvoyance, which in this sense is, can we make these images of the world around us, whether it comes from the occult or whether it comes from science or whether it comes from simply walking out there in the forest, can we bring these things into our souls and then work with them in a thinking way? Not that we fall down into some kind of trance and lie there and drift off, but rather that we very consciously investigate what is happening when we call to mind certain images, when we listen to certain words, when we read the work of occult writers. Can we bring these ideas into concepts that we can learn to think with? And this is where I feel that anthroposophy really has so much to give, because we can then look at, for example, the difference between a moth and a butterfly, and how a moth is then almost magnetized, feels like it has to drift towards the flame. It's almost hypnotized by the flame and has to fly towards it until it will just burn in the flame. Whereas if we think of the butterfly, it's seeking out the pollen, it's seeking out the flowers from which it rests and moves around in nature in this way. And its wings are colored. It's less this flying being of the night that comes in perhaps autumn, and it's more of this flying being of the summer. And that would be an example of how we could compare the two and see what their different roles would be in nature. And we can inquire into them, and we can say there is a difference whether a being is attracted towards the candle flame or whether it's attracted to the sun, and when it comes forth in the year. And those would be interesting questions to carry, for example, from a spiritual perspective. And that's just speaking to the image of the moth here with its skull head in the middle of the body. So again, in Rosicrucianism, we're really calling to mind images and not letting them just flow into us unappreciated. So we check what are the images that are being presented to us, and we ask to follow them with our understanding. So here we also have the triangles, for example, the triangles as above, so below, meeting together at this point. Now, in other points, we see these two triangles interweaving to make the Star of David. And that would be a whole other meditation that we could go in and understand those elements. But in terms of as above, so below, and coming back to our theme of Tolkien, we have here as above the spiritual world and below the earthly world. So when we talk of this casting of the spirits of darkness out of the spiritual world and into the earth, how can we see this in the change of history? How can we see this in the development of history through the 19th century and into the 20th century? Well, we don't have to look far. We can think of the development of the industrialization that comes through the 19th century and all of the challenges this brings for society in terms of a move to the cities, a move into industry, mobilization of a whole new class of working class instead of peasants, working class that are growing up in the cities. and the challenge also to the old form of things, the challenge to the aristocracy as it once was, as it lived in all the different countries, as it starts in Britain, but then extends through Europe, America, Russia, and then later, of course, over to Asia, and to become, through the course of the 20th century, a global phenomena, a globalized society. So Tolkien, at the age of 19, he travels down through Britain on a journey down through the Rhine and down to through Innsbruck and Zurich, as I said before. Now, living here in Switzerland, I went over to a place called Gimmelwald, which is up by Lauterbrunnental. And it's very beautiful village that sits there above a valley. And this valley is full of waterfalls. Now, this is quite clearly because the name of Tolkien's dwarf character is Gimli, and you can see this Gimmelwald is the name of the town up there. And when you see it, it's very reminiscent of Rivendell, full of these, forming like a natural gate into the deeper mountains, great big stone walls up either side. You can go and have a look at it. There's lots of videos about this on YouTube. And that's like Tolkien's inspiration for Rivendell. But it's not just that. The whole journey, I believe, of Tolkien down through the Rhine when he was 19, at the back of his mind, also experience of World War I and what had happened to Europe at that time and the world he saw around him in Great Britain. All of this, I think, informed many of the images that we see flowing into Lord of the Rings. So you have these two sides. You have Great Britain and everything he would have perceived through the elemental nature of Great Britain. And then you have also these memories that he spoke of. He spoke of having stayed with him his whole life, of the deep forests, and the difference between the forests of Middle Europe, of Germany and Switzerland, to those forests of Great Britain. And I think this is a wonderful meditation on also this link of friendship between the UK, between Great Britain and its mysteries, and those of Middle Europe and Europe at all. And I think you can see this in many ways also in the life of Steiner, when in the last years of his life he went over 1922 to Great Britain and was very inspired by his time there. And you can see this in many of his lectures that he also gave at Oxford, where Tolkien had been, and also the relation to Owen Barfield, which I said I will not go deep into today, but you can find out lots of stuff about the link between Owen Barfield and Rudolf Steiner, and how Owen Barfield and how Owen Barfield and C.S. Lewis and Tolkien would sit in the pub and smoke and talk about these wonderful perspectives of the future of Christianity and the arts and literature. And you can imagine there Owen Barfield himself explaining some of the ideas of anthroposophy to them. And there's something I'd like to bring in here, which is this whole sense for the elemental world. Now, this is more of a, now I'm showing you this because we're coming up to Holy Nights and we're coming up to Christmas. And this is a very nice depiction of something that people know very well in Great Britain if they have a sense for these things. And that's the whole world of fairy. And whether this comes through Shakespeare or it came from you yourself, knowing of the existence of the world of the elementals around you, fairies, elves, pixies, trolls, sprites, nixies, as they say in Germany, dwarves. And this is a very typical anthroposophical artwork. And I think it's very nice because we almost see how the spirits of the sky are less formed, but they're there. You can see them as if not fully formed. And then we have Maria or Mother Mary, pregnant, and the light of her dress. This is almost like an annunciation, awaiting the birth of Christ at this time of year. And we see the little elemental children holding the lights all around her. And this, if we know the British traditions, we know of this talk of like I think it's the book's called The Occult Commonwealth, but it speaks about the retreat of the elemental spirits, how scared, intimidated, angry at the neglect of the perception of the elemental world through materialism, through the rise of industrialism, these spirits would retreat. They would leave our world and retreat into the forests and into places where they could not be found. And it's this kind of retreat that can cause a kind of suffering for the human being who sees only a kind of grey world all around them. And one can fall into a kind of depression with this vast clockwork mechanism of industry and war and all of the things that we can see humanity going through since the 19th century. But something that we know from, something that we can develop from anthroposophy is this sense how through this deepest point of darkness, something new can be reborn. And that is a new perception of these spiritual worlds around us. And to the extent that we work with the concepts and ideas of anthroposophy in our thinking and start to analyze and question what is it we perceive in the world around us, whether it's the course of the seasons or the sun or the difference between the morning and the evening, or indeed the difference between the different festivals of the year. When we do this and we try to understand how all these sensual impressions relate to the human being, this is how we develop a growing inner spiritual sight. And this is a very lovely traditional painting from the anthroposophical tradition of a new way of conceiving these things. So we see also how Mary is part of the depiction of the landscape. Her head shapes the form of the mountain here, as if she would be the very mountain herself, and that the form is part of her very form. And if anyone's been to Dornach Goetheanum. This is very much the idea, especially with the first Goetheanum, of reflecting the shape of the surrounding land in the very architecture itself. And this is to enable us ever more to start to flow etherically with nature and with the forces of nature around us. And this is kind of summed up very nicely in the whole depiction here of how Mary rests here with the elemental children around her. So, I'm just going to change this. So back to our theme of evil. Arising global evil. Now, this doesn't sound very modern way of speaking about things, to speak about evil. But I think it's very helpful, and it's one of the helpful things that comes from anthroposophy, to be able to categorize evil into 3 different kinds of evil. And this is a very helpful thing to do, because we have, if we look at World War I, World War II, and then the post-World War world, what we're looking at is a number of different kinds of evil. Now, if we look at a kind of mechanistic evil, dualism, very nicely depicted in the horns behind me, and this kind of all-seeing eye. I don't think this will be lost on many people today to understand this in terms of ones and zeros and how you program computers and how you develop a whole culture of almost complete programming of every aspect of our lives. Now, I'm not saying evil as if we should run away from this and live in some forest. I think that would be a major misunderstanding. And I think, people who want to do that that's kind of like the view of things that we thought might help, which I'm not sure did, back in the 60s, which is to let's just go and live off the land, and which may be good for the people doing that. They might have, that's fine. And I'm not judging anyone who wants to go out and do that. But I'm talking about humanity as a whole, and what is that a solution to what's going on for humanity as a whole, where we have an ever deepening development of materialistic science based on this aspect of dualism, that man eventually can just be a brain or an animal, and that we wouldn't have a soul or spirit at all, and that we could program everything into and out of existence. And so I'm not going to go into a whole rant or philosophical description about materialistic science, because I think it's something that we can all see all around us. It's part of our experience of modern society. And if we call that to imagination, that's when we can come to this sense for an all-seeing eye, that every bank account, every transaction, cameras everywhere, smartphones everywhere. It's not a difficult imagination to bring to mind. And it's this, on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's something else that people speak about in the modern world, which is a rise of selfishness, to be only concerned with oneself. And so we've got these two gestures that in anthroposophy we refer to Ahriman and Lucifer. So Ahriman, this cold, analytical desire to number everything, make everything mechanized, conform to this outer sense for how to take apart, dissect reality, and to then structure it anew with this incredible intelligence that one can put everything together. That's what we call Ahriman. On the other hand, we have Lucifer, that desire to just look in on oneself, to be only concerned with oneself. And these two working together, we might say, well, what is this third element that we can set against these two influences? And that's when we bring in Christ. In anthroposophy, that is Christ at the turning point of time, who enables us to set something against these two movements, these two challenges that press in on our soul, and holding that middle point is the point in the middle of Christ. Now, whether you want to call it Christ or whether you want to call it the spiritual hierarchies and the magic of the elemental worlds around us, this is the difference between a spiritual science, an esoteric Christianity, and what would come from a normal church Christianity. So that's the difference. And although, you know, Tolkien was Catholic, and you can see many of the aspects of Revelation and Apocalypse come into his work, it's those very esoteric Christian imaginations that are so powerful in his work. And so it's really not like some kind of preachy, it's a preachy kind of Catholic, you know, I went to the supermarket and it reminded me of our Lord Jesus type thing. No, we feel it. It's a living elemental power that comes through these works of Lord of the Rings. And I believe there are many, many mysteries in them that we will be for many years slowly discovering, much like Steiner spoke about his own mystery dramas, that they would contained many levels of Rosicrucian mystery that we would slowly uncover. So that's part of what I'm doing here. So one of the things that Steiner is talking about in his analysis and his overview, his clairvoyant perception of the times that we live in, is that we live in a fifth post-Atlantean age. Now, before that, we have the Greco-Roman period, the fourth post-Atlantean age, and before that, the Egyptian. So our time mirrors the Egyptian time. And this is, again, something that is very, I think, very fruitful for us to contemplate, that this whole world of ones and zeros and computer programming and occult, all-seeing eyes, there is an occult establishment in the world who understands these things. And this is almost like a priesthood, just like it was back in Atlantis. So the use of the occult to influence and change and move history forward has always been this occult knowledge has always been used by a select elite group of people, and this is how was used through the 20th century and up into our own times. And it's also how Atlantis was ruled by an occult elite in the various oracles of Atlantis. And Tolkien brings all this memory back to Atlantis with his use of the term Numenor. And this is the heritage that Aragorn carries as king, as future king, carrying this legacy, this heritage of a prophesied once and future king from a previous time. Now, this previous time in the anthroposophical world conception is then Atlantis, and then we have the 7 ages which precede, which proceed from Atlantis up to our time, and this is then in 7 time periods, leading up from our time, the 5th, mirroring Egypt, the 3rd, and then a future time, the Russian epoch, although it is mentioned sometimes that this can transfer over into a South American epoch, but that would be a 6th epoch as opposed to a 2nd. Now, what does it mean? What does it mean to become invisible by putting on the ring? Now, I think there are many ways we can look at this. And before we get into this, I'm just going to put up a image that I did up recently of Gandalf, because it's nice to have a bit of Gandalf. Anyway, you can't really see Gandalf, but anyway, there he is having a bit of a smoke. So what does it mean you put on the ring and you disappear? I mean, there's many ways that you could analyze this and the ways you could philosophize about this. But what I'd like to say here is precisely when we go into this question of hypnosis, as opposed to developing a thinking, intuitive clairvoyance through the study of anthroposophy, we have 2 very different perspectives on how to live one's life. And on the other hand, we can say it much simpler. We can say, are we going to show up in life, or are we not going to show up in life? Now, this might be a question of, are we going to educate ourselves? Are we going to find a particular form of work and career to employ ourselves with? Are we going to found a family? Are we going to become an artist? Are we going to set up a business? Or there is an alternative, to slip ever further into passivity. Now, this passivity, again, this is not a question of judging that one way of some kind of action-driven life is a right way and a passive life is a non-right way, because I don't think there's for myself, I highly value the time that is spent in reading, meditation, downtime, to process, to think things through, to study, to analyze, to go inward, to do spiritual research. All of that, in my eyes, is not a passive engagement with life, but rather an active one. But it has to find a way to connect to life, to flow into life. And that's where we're called to do deeds in life. So to not show up, and I'm using this expression because it comes from Ken Wilber, and I do like his use of this word because it's so simple and it's so effective. Do we show up? Do you show up in life? Do you show up? Are you there? Have you met your responsibilities to life. And we can take this whole idea very, very far. And it takes us ever deeper into anthroposophy, and it takes us ever deeper into a true spiritual understanding of life. And in a very lovely way, this is what it means to the power of the ring, to put on the power of the ring, the occult knowledge that's all around us, to not really understand what's going on in the world around us, and to simply fall into it, or just to either overly I'm on the verge, it's on the tip of my tongue to say, overly enjoy it. And I don't mean that in any like ascetic sense of the term, but to fall into it and get lost. We know many cases. We've seen that, whether it's addiction, or whether it's addiction to work, or whether it's psychological problems, or whether it's enforcing our own fixed ideas of how things should be out in the world. There are many ways in which we can find ourselves not showing up, and that's when a kind of crisis comes, because not showing up, of course, is going to bring suffering with it. And suffering because, anthroposophically speaking, we are no longer connected to the spiritual. So we feel this. In old times, they would have spoken about the dread of God, feeling that sense of judgment. And of course, in modern times, we've come away from this, and there's many ways that you can avoid feeling this. But it's not a question of being put off by those terms. These are natural feelings in the body, that when you feel a dread, a sense of impending darkness, that's a reality, and that's a reality for many people today. And it's the source of many of the problems that people have with mental health, which the UN has identified as the third pillar over against climate change and, I think, gender equality. I'm not sure what it is, but it's one of the major pillars that the UN has identified for the 21st century, which is mental health. So the mental health problem of putting on the ring and disappearing and feeling the all-seeing eye bearing in on your soul, and how Tolkien describes how Frodo, every time he put on the ring, became thinner and thinner and felt thin inwardly. Whereas what we should be developing is this fullness of spirit. And this fullness of spirit, I'm not going to show the pictures of the great Hollywood film of the Fellowship and wonderful Aragorn and Gandalf and everybody, yeah? Because it's this fellowship, this commonwealth, that I'd like to show here. And this is I think this is from Midsummer Night's Dream. And it's this fellowship, this commonwealth of us with the elemental world, with the spiritual world around us, that is as much part of how we come to sense this fellowship between us as human beings. And this is another aspect of anthroposophy, that we sense this when we speak of Christ in the middle as setting something against Lucifer and Ahriman. Where do we find this Christ? Well, we don't find it now outwardly or in the computers or, yeah. We don't find it out there. We find it humanly in the etheric world between people. That's where we find it. And that's where these spirits seek to come to life, is in the relationships that we build between people with whom we are connected. And then those spirits that are in, that we have created in the devices that we have around us, they find also their way into a new life through us, through their work with human beings, which opens some fascinating perspectives. So when we look at, when Steiner brings details of these different beings, when he speaks of the creation of orcs and fighting Urukai and wolves and dragons, and Saruman's creating of these beings, sure, we can see all of this in the use and the development of our societies in the last, especially in the last 100 years, in how this changes humanity, that some people do indeed develop in this direction, that we do develop new elemental beings through the development of new technologies, and how imaginatively we can call this to mind and see also how some of our fellow human beings regress, while some progress and develop higher capacities and develop their humanity. There's also a possibility to regress and to sink into a former state of humanity, more like the animal level. So when we see this in Tolkien and we see depictions of orcs, which again, I'm not going to show depictions of orcs, I'm just going to show nice, lovely fairies. But yeah, you could do, and Lord of the Rings is full of those pictures of quite grotesque pictures of orcs and wolves and vampire-like beings and dragons. And sure, you can find that everywhere. So what I'd like to point out here is this use of the occult. Now, I'm going to go back to that picture. This use of the occult to manipulate humanity is what we would call in anthroposophy this third aspect of evil that was at its very beginnings, 1920s, with Rudolf Steiner. At the time of Rudolf Steiner, it was at its very beginnings, and that's the Asuric power. So this Asuric power is, or the Asuras, the power of the Asuras is in essence, and this has been associated with drugs and sexuality and things like this, which I think is a bit misleading, because while that is part of those beings, can be seen as aspects of those beings, and one can get a sense and almost like a window into understanding these beings through those phenomena. It's much more this inversion of occult knowledge to hypnotize, to control, to move the masses through the use of media towards things they wouldn't otherwise choose. And this was in its early stages back then. But like I said earlier, we can see this in many of the phenomena through the 20th century. And the third aspect, so we had the Ahrimanic aspect, we had the Asuras aspect. The other aspect, Tolkien very nicely depicts in the elves. And he speaks of how they're concerned always to retreat from this world, to go to fade into the West. Yeah, that they're concerned with the lives of men, but the lives of it's all a bit too earthy. Yeah, they don't really want to get involved in it anymore. They want to be more in a world of their magic and studies of the stars, and in their wonderful closed off palaces of Rivendell and things like this. And they want to retreat from the world. Yeah. So as much as they fight for the good powers, they are also this kind of non-committal approach. Like, you know, I'll be part Elrond, you know, here's your sword, Aragorn, you know, I'm giving you what you're destined to become, but you know, you go and do it. We'll help out. We'll help out, but actually we just want to get on our ships and get out of here. And so, although not one for one, Tolkien's giving a very nice understanding here of what in anthroposophy we would term Lucifer. So we've got Lucifer, this concern with oneself, to retreat from life, and then Ahriman to come strongly, firmly into life, and then to hold this balance between the two with Christ. Now, the figures that we have, there are different ways that we could look at this Christian path. Depicted as Frodo, or even more touchingly in the relationship of Sam to Frodo, and how lovely that is in how he accompanies him toward the end when he casts the ring into the fire. Or even in Gandalf, in how he resurrects after the fight with the Balrog. Or in Aragorn, in slowly coming into his destiny after many trials of accompanying Frodo and accompanying the fellowship. So that's where there are many aspects of the Christian mysteries that I think are very helpful. And here I'd like to bring up, if we look at this chart I have, again, this is very much sort of introductory stuff for the study of anthroposophy. But I'm going to look at this chart here in relation to, now we have the 9 rings, and we have the 9 ring wraiths. Now, I believe this is part of the deep occult wisdom of Lord of the Rings and of Tolkien, of how this relates to the 9 bodies of the human being. So we're going to look at this from the anthroposophical perspective and look at how in the story, these 9 beings, these 9 members of the human being, we are presented with the 9 rings over against 9 ring wraiths, and how it's a fellowship that learns to develop the power of these 9 bodies over against, if we don't do this consciously, if we are so to speak hypnotized by the occult, we instead feel this presence of the 9 ring wraiths. And we can see this very nicely in the books of how on Weathertop Hill, when Frodo fights against the ring wraiths and he's stabbed by them. But we can see a very deep truth here, that if we do not interact with the new spiritual understandings of the times that we are in, they can very much be used against us, and that we would start to lose consciousness and become ever thinner, to the extent that we wouldn't understand the modern world that we are in. And part of this is the growth of, if we don't want to talk about dark powers, that's fine. We can talk about the growth of technology and the fact that, if we remember the chart right at the beginning, man imitates the world that is around him. And this is part of how a child imitates their parents, or how we imitate the world on a very unconscious level, subconscious. The world shapes us. The world that we are in, the law of imitation shapes us. So whether we want to talk about dark powers, or we want to talk about a world of tech and surveillance and city skyscrapers and media and smartphones, we can talk about either, but it's that imitation that is shaping the human being. So part of this story of disappearing, putting on the ring, is the challenge that if this happens to us and we start to lose our humanity, we start to become thin and hardened and automatic in our response to life and not show up. All those things. If that were to happen, then we can feel this presence of the 9 ring wraiths, the 9 powers of those bodies that we sense as an impending darkness. Now, these, from an anthroposophical perspective, this is a very lovely chart that Rudolf Steiner gave to Mary Steiner, and it depicts very nicely the 9 bodies. So here we have the physical body, etheric body, as rings. Yeah, as it going deeper into ourselves. Physical body, this outer circle. Yeah. Second, within it, etheric body, sentient body, and then we have sentient soul, intellectual soul, consciousness soul, and then the upper trinity, which is spirit self, upper trinity pointing to Jupiter, Venus, and Vulcan, the spirit self, the life spirit, and the spirit man. And I think this chart is very helpful to understand the connection between Lord of the Rings and the occult truths that lie in the work, because that is where we find this relation to anthroposophy and how we perceive the world. So very much the sense world that we see around us and in these great depictions of Tolkien, especially in the films, but also imagine when when I read it, it was imagination. But that view out into the world, this is our sentient body, the world of the senses, yeah, as they shape all of the sunlight colors, textures, sounds, everything that we see around us. And we see how this relates here to here. It's pointed here, sentient body, relating here to old moon. And then we have the sentient soul within this. We form our own feelings over against what it is that we see in the world around us. And then we can go deeper, and we can try to study these things. And this is where the study of anthroposophy comes in, that these ways of all of this is taken from theosophy and from occult science as the foundation texts of anthroposophy. And although Steiner has done hundreds and hundreds of lectures, and he always stressed you should go back to the key texts, and the key texts are learning how to understand these concepts and how to start to perceive them so you can think with them into the life around you. And to the extent that you think into the life around you, you're starting to discover these new worlds through intuitive clairvoyance. Yeah. So it's very different to visionary clairvoyance, because you're working with concepts. You're building at the same time as your meditative work, you're building exact intuitive understanding of the concepts of anthroposophy. And this is something also that Steiner said. This is the way to activate and use the intellect in a right and appropriate way in modern times, so that you can engage the soul in the activity of occult work, and not let yourself be overwhelmed by all the flood of images that we have in the modern world. And the danger is that they would flood over you and you wouldn't be able to hold your ich conscious over against this great flood of images. And that's part of the problem that we see more and more in modern times in all the different New Age and occult teachings that are out there in the world. The danger is to flow out into visionary clairvoyance and to not understand that this whole visionary world of visionary clairvoyance is very much the world that is inspired into us by the media and by the conscious use of technology to inspire those very pictures and ideas into our minds. So if we don't engage ourselves in educating ourselves with what is going on psychologically in these times, we fall into hypnosis, which is again a theme that I picked up briefly at the beginning in the relation between Jesuitism and Rosicrucianism. And I would encourage you to read those two lectures, of which I've done lectures, of which I've done talks and lectures before, to really understand that we don't fall into that hypnosis. Rather, we learn to think into this understanding of a true occult perception of what's going on, so that we don't fall into the dream state, but we are conscious of it. So here we see the physical body, etheric body, sentient body, and soul, the three soul bodies, and then the Trinity, the upper Trinity, relating to the three future planets. Now, again, how can we, to finish off, how can we see this in Lord of the Rings? Well, these things are present, and it's the question of sight that I think is really very helpful in the movies of Lord of the Rings. The question of sight, the gaze. So we have, if we think of the gaze of greed, yeah, we can see this in different characters in Lord of the Rings. It could be the gaze of greed of Boromir, who wants the ring for himself, for Gondor. It could be the gaze of covetousness, to have something for yourself. Now, that could be Gollum. He wants my precious. He wants it for himself. Covetousness. I want that thing for me. Yeah. He's not even wanting particular power or anything. He just wants that thing. He wants that. That's my trinket. That's my little thing that I really want. And then the gaze of ambition. Yeah, we can see this in Saruman. Yeah, that look in his eyes, the ambition of what he could do when he has this ring. Then we have the gaze of vanity. If we think of Galadriel, when she's tempted by what she could, all would bow before me in my great and glorious beauty. Something like this. If she had the power of the ring, and you see her eyes dilating in that scene and going almost black with quite a terrific power. So the gaze of vanity, the gaze of power. Now, whether this is the gaze of Saruman, did we already have Saruman? I think it was Saruman, or was that the gaze of ambition? But you can see this. You can pick this up through different gazes, as you call them to mind through the film. The gaze of power, the gaze of fear, when they speak of Sauron's fear with the all-seeing eye darting from here, there, and everywhere to try and master the whole field. That is the gaze of fear, of what could possibly usurp my power. Then we have the gaze of the community. And I think this is quite nice if we think of how Bilbo and Frodo's concern the whole time for what the other hobbits think. Yeah, like the kind of bourgeois problem of people peeking from round their curtains. And it's funny how there's a nice depiction in Tolkien does at the end when when Saruman has actually insinuated himself, he's been defeated, but he's somehow insinuated himself into the very social fabric of the Shire. And it's a nice image of that. I think they've even set up some kind of factory and imposing, quite exploitative working conditions on the hobbits. So it's always nice how Tolkien gives you this vast world and always refers you back to your daily practical life and says, look at how these things are playing out in the very practical dynamics of your own practical life. So it's not, again, not seeking this in some far distant universe. And that's the whole dialectic between his fellowship and the four hobbits and the smaller group of Frodo and Sam within the fellowship. That is so lovely. So we have the gaze of fear, the gaze of community, the gaze of kingship. If we think of Aragorn's gaze, yeah, if we think of Aragorn, how in Bree at the tavern, his gaze is often downcast and shrouded. Yeah, you don't see it at all. And it speaks of long years spent in the wilderness until at the end, especially in the film, you see the gaze as it meets the eyes of Arwen at the wedding, or you see the gaze of kingship as he regards the crowd around at the Minas Tirith, when he looks out on the gathered crowds there. And the gaze of kingship is another gaze. And then I guess finally the clairvoyant gaze, the gaze of Gandalf. himself. That wise, far-seeing gaze that you often see when he's puffing on his pipe and he's seeing into the distance. So I think that's a very nice way to finish, to think of, call to mind in your own mind those gazes of the different people, and think about, what do those gazes help you to think of in terms of one's own relation to spiritual occult truths. Now, in relation to anthroposophy, of course, I would say from a Rosicrucian perspective, we are not letting those gazes become unconscious in our life. Yeah. We are not then those different fragmented characters, sometimes having gazes of greed into life, sometimes following power, sometimes seeking to manipulate or be scared, or to follow our great visions that we might have clairvoyantly. All of that, for me, is the opposite path, or we might say the Jesuit path, or we might say the hypnotic path. The real Rosicrucian esoteric path is to consciously understand those gazes, and that underneath them, I think I even depicted 9 different gazes there, that underneath those gazes are true ways of looking at the world in terms of the different bodies, and to learn to understand these bodies, because by thinking them and seeing how they relate to experience, or seeing how they relate to an artwork like this of Tolkien, we can see, we can develop a power precisely through thinking. So whereas we have the gaze of greed, the gaze of covetousness, the gaze of ambition, the gaze of vanity, the gaze of power, the gaze of fear, the gaze of the community, the gaze of kingship, and the clairvoyant gaze, that all of those gazes are ways we can become conscious of how we are interwoven with life, with other people, etherically between ourselves and nature, and through other people. And that is how we start to explore our experience from these different perspectives. So I guess to finish, there's something that I've always found fascinating as a reflection. Many of the times in history, what can't flow into society flows into art. So whereas on the outer stage of the world we have conflict, ever deeper neoliberal dominance of finance and trade in economy, and that spiritual ideas somehow haven't been able to flow into an outer form, like Steiner's threefolding, for example, or a form that might embody higher ideals. Whereas we might not have been able to see this outwardly, the need for new ideas, of bringing ideas of the spiritual, of community, of fellowship into life, these get expressed in art. And so they still have that reality. They just exist then within and flow into the arts. And I think it's part of anthroposophy, is to help us to ever deeper understand that these are not whims of fantasy, but these are realities of life that we can see a bridge between a true spiritual science and some of the truths that are embodied in this work of Tolkien. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. today. If you want to follow any of our work, you can at the Anthroposophical Facebook group, where I write up a lot of these insights into anthroposophy. And we're running a course over Holy Nights. If you want to take part in that, then please get in touch. And I'll be doing up some other videos over Holy Nights in relation to some of these themes. Any questions, put them in the comments down below. If you haven't subscribed, it's a help to the channel if you do subscribe. So click on the subscribe button and enjoy this last week of Advent. Ciao, ciao.